Thank you. Welcome back to the inquiry into drug, poison and controlled substance amendment regulation of a personal use of cannabis bill 2023. Joining us for our last session is Professor Iain McGregor from the Lambert Initiative. Welcome, Professor.
Thank you very much.
Just before I continue, I just want to read you information regarding the evidence you're about to give us. All evidence taken is protected by public privilege, as provided by the Constitution Act 1975, and first subject to the revision of the Legislative Council standing orders. Therefore, the information you provide during this hearing is protected by law. You're protected against any actions for what you say during this hearing, but if you go elsewhere and repeat the same thing, those comments may not be protected by this privilege. Any deliberately false evidence or misleading of the committee may be considered contempt of Parliament. All evidence is being recorded. You will be provided approved version of the transcript following the hearing. The transcript will ultimately be made public and posted on the committee website. Just for record purpose, could you please state your full name and the organisation you're with, please?
Yes, my name is Professor Iain McGregor. I'm the Academic Director of the Lambert Initiative for Cannabinoid Therapeutics at the University of Sydney.
Thank you, Professor. I know you made a submission. Could you, I'd just like to invite you to a quick, brief opening statement if you like, before I open the floor to my colleague to ask you questions.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, well, thank you for the opportunity to give evidence this afternoon. The Lambert Initiative is a philanthropically funded research organisation devoted to the study of medicinal cannabis. And we undertake a wide range of studies, everything from a drug discovery pipeline involving cellular and animal pharmacology, through clinical trials, through to studies that inform drug policy around cannabis. We do a lot of survey work, community amongst health professionals and users of medicinal cannabis, and also have a focus on impairments relating to driving and workplace activities. Although our primary mission is around medicinal cannabis, inevitably we run into recreational cannabis in that many medical users are what we call dual users, so they're using for both medical and non-medical purposes. So we have an interest in policy development in this area. Probably two things that I would like to highlight in my evidence today. The first is a study that I furnished the committee with just before Christmas, and that was an investigation of cultivators in the Australian Capital Territory subsequent to the decriminalisation of cultivation of small amounts of cannabis in the Territory in 2020. And so we undertook quite a detailed survey of these cultivators and examined their lived experience around cannabis cultivation, their attitudes towards policy change, and what you might call some wrinkles in the policy that could be improved upon. And we also conducted an analysis of their cannabis. The second policy issue that I think we come across quite a lot is the extent to which the current legal access to medicinal cannabis being used by people for non-medical reasons. And we have quite a lot of interest in whether the existing model of medicinal cannabis access could be actually co-opted as a vehicle for providing, I guess, medically and pharmacist-guided access to cannabis that can be used for non-medical purposes. And that's something that we give quite a lot of thought to as well. So they're probably the two main things that are in scope in terms of what I'd be able to discuss with you today, but I'm happy to take questions around that.
I'll keep my question brief and short as well. Regarding your study on cannabis use, now this bill is mainly going to focus on recreation cannabis as well. So from your study, if we legalise cannabis in Victoria, do you see the increased use of cannabis in young adults, that mean under 18?
Yes, so this is a question that has been examined in many research papers subsequent to legislation in a broad range of jurisdictions throughout the world. And I think the bottom line is really that what the evidence is telling us is that there's not really any great concern around increased uptake amongst young people. So for example, with the ACT study that we've looked at, there's nothing in the medical, coming from the medical authorities, there's nothing in wastewater analysis to suggest that the decriminalization initiative there had any major effect on cannabis consumption. And in fact, the ACT, I think, has the lowest cannabis consumption of any jurisdiction within Australia, despite having the most relaxed laws. If you go to the Netherlands, for example, it's another place historically where there's been a lot of relaxation of cannabis laws, and their young people have relatively low rates of cannabis consumption compared to other jurisdictions within Europe. Same story in Canada. I'm not aware of any signal that there's been a massive expansion of cannabis use in young people subsequent to legalization in 2018. So I think we can probably conclude from all of this evidence that it's unlikely that relaxation of laws within other Australian jurisdictions will have any major impact on consumption.
Thank you. Michael?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor McGregor. Your research has been very timely for this committee, to say the least. I noticed it was quite interesting that you found some distinctions between users' perceptions of what sort of levels of THC in cannabis and CBD were in the cannabis and what you actually found. Also particularly interesting that you found that there was a mean average of 9% THC content, or very, very close to. In fact, that was lower than what gets picked up by organised crime. Given the fact that, as far as I'm aware, this is the first time that anyone under the ACT model has been able to have their cannabis tested, and that there are no up and running services where people can go and get their cannabis checked for things like THC levels in the ACT. If we were to adopt that model in Victoria, how important do you think it is that we, whether it's private sector, public sector, that there is some sort of testing capability for people to actually use and be confident that they are taking what they think they are?
Yes, I mean, it's not the first study actually that we've done where we've the dissociation between what people think is in their cannabis that they're using and what actually is in there. And we find that endlessly fascinating and speculate on this. I mean, one of the major things is that people assume that their cannabis has a lot of CBD in it for some reason. I mean, not universally, but there is a kind of broad perception. For example, we did a study with the parents of children who had epilepsy, and these people were dealing with very sick children, but were so desperate to get hold of medicinal cannabis products that they would make them themselves or get them illegally. And they all assumed that there was a huge amount of CBD in the oils that they were giving their children. And what we found, in fact, that there was very little CBD in any of the oils that were being used. And I think that helped actually with the increased provision of legally available CBD oils in Australia. That study was done back in 2016, 2017. And it's similar with the ACT study that we've just published, which suggested a real dissociation between what people wished was in their cannabis and what wasn't. And I think we make the point in the paper that the provision of testing services would probably be quite a good thing in terms of allowing people to focus on cannabis that may be less harmful for health. When you add CBD to your cannabis in addition to THC, arguably you end up with a product that is better for your mental health. CBD has anxiety reducing properties. It has a range of other potential benefits. And so if you could guide people or confirm for people that their cannabis did have CBD in it, that would be a valuable thing. And also to know the THC content as well. Although you have to be wary of getting an arms race. You know, as soon as you start measuring THC certain sections of the cultivation community will be keen to win the Cannabis Cup, as it were, for having, I think the biggest reading we've had is 35% THC, some confiscated cannabis. But a lot of the prescription cannabis that's available in Australia now is between 20 and 30% THC, which we do have some concerns about. The one thing that gives some less concern is that we know that people tend to titrate. So if you're using very high potency cannabis, people tend to use less than if it's weaker cannabis. That titration has been well described in the scientific literature, but you worry perhaps about more vulnerable members of the community using high potency cannabis in the same way as they would use low potency, i.e. consuming greater amounts.
Thank you very much, Professor. I am out of time, but if I may just ask a very quick question with a quick answer if possible. The results show some high levels of arsenic, lead and cadmium, but only in a very small number of samples. I actually only recently discovered that cannabis is quite good at absorbing those minerals from the ground. In those small number of cases where that's present, is it as risky and as concerning as I might assume it to be, to see those higher levels?
I mean, it's obviously not very good to vaporize cannabis with high levels. There's only really one sample where we had serious concerns. You'll find heavy metals throughout Australian gardens. And I make the point that if the person was growing lettuce or tomatoes, they also have had arsenic in them. Mm-hmm. But cannabis is an excellent bioaccumulator, and there's a lot of interest in using hemp to remediate old industrial sites where there are heavy metals. But obviously, if there was a publicly available testing program similar to what we've done in the CANAC study, then people can identify these potential problems in their growing site.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Rachel?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Professor McGregor, for speaking with us today and your submission. And yes, very timely that your research has come out so that we can review that with you. What's come up quite a bit throughout this inquiry has been the question around gifting and sharing. And I note that in your study, it showed that the majority of people who are growing cannabis in the ACT did report that they were sharing with family, with friends, with other cultivators. In your view, how important is it that any reform of cannabis laws in Victoria don't criminalise that element of sharing, much like they do in the ACT? And it'd be great to hear your experience of doing research in that space.
I think it's extremely important that this issue is managed. I mean, 10% of the cultivators in our study were what we call altruistic cultivators, so they weren't even using the cannabis for themselves. And in fact, the study was inspired by a gentleman who contacted us who was growing cannabis for his desperately ill wife who had brain cancer, and she was getting extraordinary relief from home cultivated cannabis, and he was desperate to know what was in it because it was having miraculous effects, but he wasn't a user himself. So I think that, if you were to think of ACT Plus, something that was an enhancement on the current model that we see in the ACT, that would be one of the things that would have to be included. When you have a system where the majority of cultivators are sharing their cannabis and breaking the law and doing something, that tells you that the laws are imperfect, and perhaps the German model of cannabis growing clubs is something that we might want to look at. I'm acutely aware with the ACT study that we did that a lot of the cultivators were privileged middle-class people who were fully employed and owned their own homes. And obviously, for more vulnerable members of the community, people with disabilities, younger people who can't afford to get on the property ladder, there's less opportunities to be able to cultivate not a home. And in fact, we found amongst the past cultivators, people that had given up cultivation, they were often younger people who had greater instability in terms of their housing. So some kind of model where you can altruistically grow, or you can form a consortium or club to swap notes on cultivation. That was another thing that came out, that it's actually quite tricky cultivating cannabis, and we had a long list of problems that are mentioned in the paper, everything from spider mites to inability to thrive during the harsh, Canberra winter. About, I think it was 80% of cultivators reported some sort of difficulties that they experienced. So that would be another benefit to having social communities around that. You would have to think carefully about where the line falls between that sort of shared social cultivation and kind of more sinister industrial level supply of cannabis for profit. I mean, a very small number, I think it was only 3% of cultivators were growing cannabis to sell in our particular cohort, which was quite encouraging.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Heath?
Sorry, my questions have already been asked, so thank you so much.
Thank you. David?
Thank you, Professor McGregor. Always love your work. Can I ask you about wet weight of cannabis? The ACT legislation's got this 50 grams dry, 150 wet. When we spoke to the ACT police about wet weight, they said, we don't even use that anymore. It's just too difficult. We just count the number of plants. Could you perhaps share with the committee your sense of how practical it is to define wet weight? And does that sort of 50-150 ratio work?
I think, the greatest due respect to the people that drafted the legislation in the ACT, the wet weight and dry weight numbers in relation to numbers of cannabis plants was wildly inaccurate. And even back then in 2020, we probably could have consulted the literature and found more accurate data. I mean, the primary problem is more to do with the dry weight, that a healthy cannabis plant will produce 120 grams of dry, and if you have two of these plants legally available, you end up with 240 grams, which is fivefold the 50-gram limit that they impose. So I very much hope that you'll bring in your own legislation in Victoria. I would suggest that, relaxing the dry weight would probably be the most practical solution. If it were two cannabis plants, then you might want to contemplate a 250-gram dry limit. Interestingly, the cultivators we spoke to were, for the most part, quite happy with a 4-plant limit. I think the majority of them were quite happy with that. There was no great desire to have 100 plants or 500 plants or industrial installations, but there was a great deal of anxiety around these limits and the possibility that the two plants they were growing were going to land them in difficulty with the law because of the dry weight produced. And I agree. I think the wet weight 150 to dry weight 50 is not a good equation. I think when we looked at the estimates from the cultivators, 150 wet, I think, was turning into 120 of dry. So that was not very useful at all. So these things have to be looked at under the microscope, and there are data available now to allow you to do it.
So in the draft bill that the committee's looking at, I mean, there's plant numbers, there's 50 grams for what you can be taking out in public.
Yes.
And there's not an attempt to define it. I mean, is it actually a fool's errand to try and define a sort of wet weight, dry weight ratio if you don't need to?
I don't think so. I think you're spot on there. That we should be focusing on dry weight because that's what people use, and we should be focusing on number of plants as well. I think the idea maybe of limiting the amount that you can take out in public is not a bad one either, but as long as there's a proviso that you can have a greater store at home. I'm also mindful that the climate's not terrific down your part of the world, perhaps not as bad as Canberra, but you might want to take that into account as well. One issue obviously was that 11% were growing hydroponically, and that was breaking the law as well. So that's something else you may wish to consider. Not all the cultivators were aware that hydroponic growth was against the legislation in the ACT, but hydroponics is obviously more favorable if you're in a harsher climate. So it's maybe something else that the committee may wish to consider.
Can I get a clarification on that?
I'll go to I.
Sure.
No, I honestly don't mind if we get that clarified before it comes to me. Is that okay?
Okay,
Yeah.
David?
Okay, just to clarify that point, I guess looking at, I think from a growing point of view, it's very similar in Melbourne to Canberra. If we're aiming to sort of reduce dependence on illicit by allowing home grow,
Yes.
as I understand it, the climatic reality is that if you can't grow in a greenhouse or indoors hydroponically, it's virtually impossible to have that dependency. You're only going to get one crop in the backyard, and then it's highly unlikely you'll have enough to get you through the year, if I can put it that way. Does that seem a reasonable proposition?
Yes, that's right. I mean, the majority of the cultivators in our study, I know there's a lot of information in the paper, but you will find somewhere the notion that the cultivators were, for the most part, accessing other cannabis in addition to their cultivated cannabis. So that was either medicinal cannabis on prescription or illicit sources. And they were consuming on average 1 gram a day. So if you think of 365 grams per year, and plants that were maybe only yielding, 2 plants outdoor yielding 240 grams of cannabis, well, 120 grams for each plant, then you end up with a deficit of 125 grams on average amongst these cultivators. And that starts to explain why they were moving to other sources to make up that shortfall to be able to 1 gram per day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Professor. Just looking through what I understand from the work you've been doing. So 311 ACT residents surveyed post-decriminalisation in the ACT who currently or previously cultivated. I understand you found that 48% said that avoidance of illegal suppliers was a primary motivation for cultivation. I mean, therefore, looking here in Victoria with this bill, us considering decriminalising, could we expect then here a proportion of the community, if this bill passes, will grow their own in avoidance of engaging with that illicit market? Piercing the balloon, potentially, I think is what it was referred to as today.
I think, yes, that was a strong motivation for people to cultivate their own cannabis, that they didn't want to engage with criminal networks. Obviously, supply of the self and others for medicinal and non-medicinal purposes was another motivation. The one that surprised us the most was just the sheer enjoyment that people gained from growing cannabis. I didn't see that one coming, but that was listed as motivation by a large number of cultivators. And also when we spoke to some of them, it kept coming up that it's actually a really enjoyable process and very satisfying to grow something like that becomes a medicine. So that's another thing to consider in your deliberations.
Thanks, Professor. Just on cultivation further, now from a public health and harm reduction perspective, the study, as I understand it, suggests that education on cultivation best practices and quality control measures could mitigate health risks associated with, say, contamination from cultivation. Now, could you just explain a bit further what is meant by that and what would that look like in the Victorian context?
Yes, well, I guess if you had testing available similar to what we've done ourselves, and just to clarify, we contracted out the pesticide and heavy metal testing to Chem Centre Perth. They're a world-class facility for that kind of analysis. We analysed the THC and CBD content ourselves. But obviously, if people were allowed, say a yearly test sponsored or partly subsidised by the government, then they'd be able to just find out if there are any potential nasties within their homegrown cannabis. And I'd point out that that's vastly superior to what happens when you're accessing illicit networks. We know that some of the criminal gangs involved in cultivation use high levels of pesticides and have no concern whatsoever around circulating product widely that has been grown in less than optimal growing conditions. So it's a great advantage in a way to have that information available to cultivators and to get them out of these illegal networks.
Fantastic. Thanks, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. That comes to our time. And I want to thank you so much for your time, giving me your contribution today.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Just this come to the end of our session. Could all, before we do, I just want to say thank you to the staff, broadcasting team and staff for assisting today, and my committee members for a very delightful day.
Robust day. Thank you, Chair.
Questioning.
It's so polite.
Could I ask the broadcasting team hands-on equipment to be turned off now, please?